There's a script I've been kicking around in my head for the last couple of months. It's in the larval stage, so it sits in the back of my brain and leaches information until it gets engorged enough to hatch. The basic idea was that I wanted to explore the big questions of leftism, or rather, I think I wanted to make a case that left-wing ideology asks the best questions, or something like that. So I was going to break it down into the biggest, most important questions you should ask about any and every aspect of human society. The first question was going to be, who does the work? I think that, along with its sibling, and who keeps the rewards, are two of the most obvious big lefty questions. Asking them and following honest answers leads you to everything from the formation of the proletariat a la Karl Marx, to the patriarchal creation of the class of women a la Monique Wittig, to the fuel for colonial atrocity a la Cedric Robinson. Present as a leitmotif in the calls for land back all the way to the calls for prison abolition. That deceptively simple dichotomy shows up in almost every instance of human inequality and injustice. Everywhere around us now, we see capitalism eroding the number of people keeping the money in order to grow the number of people doing the work. Industries are congealing into monopolies, jobs are being offshored to countries with less protections, and AI technology threatens to kill entire business models, throwing millions out of work. The metastasizing rentier economy of the 2020s chips away at more and more of the working class, drip-feeding more and more back to a dwindling number of rapacious landlords. I was going to show a bunch of charts and graphs and headlines that really drove home this point. It was going to be very persuasive. And then I was going to make the next big question, who is expected and who is excluded? This one was going to be all about how asking this question can expose a ton of ableism and classism embedded into the world around us. It's almost like shining one of those UV lights around a motel room and exposing all the hidden, unclean stains. This question can reveal things about places, showing us the restaurant accessible only by stairs does not expect to serve people using wheelchairs. It can also reveal things about processes. For example, ask this question about stores that refuse to accept cash. Who is excluded in cashless stores? Unhoused people who rely on donations, youth or undocumented neighbors who can't have a bank account, or heck, how about political dissidents who don't need their purchases tracked? I really wanted to dig into this just to show how uncomfortable that question can get, showing that you can ask it about things like DSA meetings, or video essays, or voting, or psychiatry. And it can expose some nastiness deeply embedded in many of us, even those of us who think we're the good guys. And after that, I was kicking around a couple of other ones, trying to figure out a good number, trying to keep it punchy, like one idea I had was who gets second chances or something like that, because it exposes a lot of the issues of bigotry, patriarchy, and oligarchy. The Brock Turners of the world can horrifically rape people and get off with a sob story about their future, whereas black teens are hassled mercilessly and treated like veteran criminals even for minor offenses. But a more potent idea I considered was, whose deaths are acceptable? Because that one really gets to the heart of racism, colonialism, and the way that neoliberalism pacifies the working class of the imperial core by outsourcing misery everywhere else. It's one of the questions that cuts right past the smug liberal exterior and forces even people with quote-unquote good politics to confront the wars and nation building they depend on to keep the status quo comfortable. So anyway, I'd been tossing those questions around in my mind the last couple of weeks, writing little snippets in my head, cogitating on some possible themes or gimmicks for the video, and I was pretty sure I had a solid scaffolding going in my brain, and I was getting ready to, lock in and bang it out. And then something happened. I watched The Zone of Interest, and suddenly, all I want to talk about is noise. If you don't know, The Zone of Interest is a 2023 film directed by Jonathan Glazer in which a family, up until now living in luxury despite an ongoing war, must grapple with the possibility that the father will be relocated by his employer, severing the community roots they had carefully planted over the past decade. Oh, and also the dad is Auschwitz Commandant Rudolf Hess. It's hard to describe Zone of Interest because on paper it sounds like a fairly pedestrian slice of domestic banality. A mother struggling as a household manager, a father struggling with work politics, a family threatened with a huge disruption to their ongoing idol. Of course, in action, there's absolutely nothing pedestrian about living next door to one of history's most infamous atrocities. Every sweep of a broom, every washed dish, every tiny marital smile happens with unimaginable horror just out of frame. Its closest peak at the nightmare is the use of prisoners as a slave labor force around the Hess estate. And even then, we never see a prisoner physically abused. In fact, the worst that happens is Hedwig Hess yelling at a local German girl on staff, vaguely threatening her with the ovens next door. The film never directly depicts exactly what's happening just over the fence. It doesn't have to. One of the ongoing motifs in the film is an exploration of quiet versus noise. Many scenes involve long, languid shots of domestic activity that capture the burble of sounds produced as a home is made and maintained. And sometimes, in the background, a gunshot, an indistinct yell, a barked command, another gunshot. And was that a scream? Again and again in the film, we the audience hear noises that contain within them an ocean of suffering. We know what machinery is producing that noise, and the horror of the film starts to set in when you recognize that Rudolf Hess also knows the machinery producing that noise, and he simply no longer hears it. Again and again in the film, we see that the punctuation of screams and gunfire has no effect on the Hess family's peace. Rudolf wanders near the family pool enjoying his cigar. Hedwig and her friends gab at the kitchen table. Even the children don't seem bothered by it. In contrast, we see a quick little scene in the middle of the film depicting a staff member as absolutely miserable staying up late with the crying infant. Finally, we found a noise that bothers this family. There's a certain sense in which Zone of Interest is not a subtle film. It's about a family living next door to a concentration camp, for fuck's sake. It's an hour and 45 minutes of Jonathan Glazer and Martin Amis leaning into your face going, "You get it, right? You get what we're doing here, right?" On the other hand, sitting here in 2024, I can't help but think that perhaps this is exactly as biting as the film needs to be because so many members of the audience are the Hess family and they don't even realize it. An easy comparison, and one Glazer himself echoed in his Oscar speech, would be to Israeli families living a couple miles from the Gaza Strip where their government is currently committing genocide. I think too of the extended families of violent Israeli looters who know their cousins or their brothers are displacing Palestinians from their homes and olive farms. The spiritual distance between Rudolf Hess smoking by his pool and Israelis partying on the beach up the road from their local concentration camp is, let's say, snug. A more difficult comparison to stomach, if not to make, would be to me and my family here in the United States, and perhaps to you and your family too. I think it would be a mistake while watching Zone of Interest to locate the film's horror in the proximity of a family to an atrocity, rather than in the bored disinterest that atrocity is met with. Because it is not lost on me that exactly like the Hess family, I am enjoying a good life at the expense of others. In the historic sense, my ancestors, broadly speaking, colonized places that didn't belong to them, confiscated material wealth, used exploitative labor to grow that wealth over generations, and rejiggered laws to protect them and harm those they disapproved of. My grandfather was a ditch digger for the gas company, but even he was able to save up some money and buy rental properties. Many black grandfathers were given no such option. But even if I set that aside as, in the past, not my fault, my family still enjoys disproportionate comfort because others are forced to live uncomfortably. We buy low-cost clothing for my daughter, receive it with free 2-day shipping, we enjoy tropical fruits all year round, we enjoy vegetables that were picked fresh thousands of miles away. I have bought, broken, and discarded all manner of electronic devices relying on lithium and cobalt and gold. None of these things would be possible affordably if other people were not being overworked, underpaid, threatened with deportation, or threatened with torture and death. My family has too much because other families are not allowed to have enough. The global economy, fueled by racial capitalism and protected by corporate violence, is so vast and complex that I think a lot of families in the imperial core struggle to really understand where we sit in the hierarchy. Just high enough for a few benefits to buy our loyalty, just low enough to keep being bled dry, and just pacified enough to blame the exsanguinated husks below us for our dissatisfaction, rather than the guys running this horror show. But even still, every day, people are starting to wake up and realize that something is wrong. In Zone of Interest, Hedwig's mother Lena comes to visit the estate, and Hedwig does her best to impress her. However, gradually, Lena begins to realize why she's been feeling ill at ease. She sees the smokestacks of Auschwitz blackening the sky, and she realizes what it is she's been smelling all around the estate. Once the veil has been pierced, suddenly her senses are awakened. What was once background ambiance becomes a front and center performance that cannot be ignored. She leaves in the middle of the night, walking away from Omelas for all the good that does. Which brings me back to the original hook for this video, discovering the big questions. While all the other ones I mentioned in the intro are great and important and vital, after watching Zone of Interest, I'm left asking myself a big question. What is noise? For the purposes of this discussion, for me, a noise is a discordant sound that interrupts the scene, that commands attention, perhaps even demanding a response. The dishwasher turning on is a noise, but its low, swooshing hum usually isn't. Gentle rain on the windows is probably not a noise, but the crack of thunder is. Perhaps for you, the sound of droning traffic is peaceful, and the roar of a motorcycle isn't. Sorry, squid tips. For me, when I think of noise, I think back to working weekend graveyards as a cop, sitting in my unit with the windows down, writing my reports behind a building, when suddenly, somewhere in town, you might hear an ominous pop, 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 or perhaps a screech, crash, boom, bang. Sounds that tear through the night and get your hackles up. I suppose what I'm really describing is sounds that disturb. And I've noticed that if you hear a sound often enough, even one that's a little annoying, even one that's prickly and unsoothing, if you hear it long enough, often enough, if it just feels like a natural part of life, that noise tends to simply become sound. It ceases to disturb. That's why I think what is noise is such an interesting question, because what it's really asking is, what disturbs your peace and normality? What feels discordant? What breaks your enjoyment of the status quo? And for me, what is noise actually has little to do with sound per se. It could be a sound, the sound of construction as they widen yet another community-killing Strode, the sound of Israeli missiles vaporizing children just down the street. But for me, anything can be noise if it disturbs my peace. For example, as the COVID pandemic really heated up in late 2020, early 2021, I began to notice that we were suddenly calling retail workers like cashiers and shelf stockers essential workers, when in years past they were mocked and abused for demanding living wages, union protections, and basic human dignity. Every clap for the workers' feel-good campaign I saw lodged like a bone in my throat, knowing the contempt people have for quote-unquote unskilled labor, even as they were now completely dependent on that labor to get their little treats. All that "we're in this together" happy horseshit from the rich was a noise most odious. I think of slave labor being used by Nestle, by diamond cartels, by cobalt mines, by our own prisons here in the United States. Every time I see someone with some over-engineered smart coffee machine that has never in history needed a computer chip, every time I walk down a candy aisle 5 shelves high and a mile deep, creating the illusion of variety, every time I have to replace a computer mouse or my earbuds or a phone charger or a spatula, it's all become so noisy, knowing why they are so cheap to buy, knowing some of the hands that assembled them are the same size as my daughters. And for deeply personal reasons, I think of police work. How even after I got out of law enforcement, I saw the day-to-day excesses and abuses of policing as just the cost of doing business, an unfortunate but unremarkable annoyance in an otherwise peaceful society. Cases like Tamir Rice and Sandra Bland bothered me, but I saw those as individual errors made by an otherwise normal institution. It was only after the 1-2 punch of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor that I could suddenly hear the noise of unaccountable state terror agents stomping through our communities. A staccato snare drum tattoo which has become quite intolerable to me. And so I look around me at others who are not disturbed, people for whom these kinds of situations remain tolerable background ambiance, and I remember that it wasn't so long ago that I too was able to smoke a pipe next to a pool without hearing any noises coming from over there. And I think, how do we make noise noisier for people? How do we get them to recognize the stink permeating their homes, their offices, their snacks, and their toys? And then I have an even darker thought. Many of these people are bothered by noise, but for them it's the existence of black people, queer people, disabled people, and immigrants that disturb their peace. How many vibrant communities experienced an increase in literal noise complaints as their neighborhoods became gentrified? How many joyful celebrations have been reclassified as public nuisances because the wrong sorts of people were happy? So the question isn't even how do we make noise noisier, but how do we get people to hear the right noises at all? It would be natural to look towards Zone of Interest for ideas given that the film has such an expert command of sound design. But for better or worse, I don't think that the film is one that wants to offer any answers. I suspect the filmmakers would even say that they don't have the answers. The film portrays a single family at a single location during a single period of a single crisis. All it can do, and I think all it wants to do, is to have you spend some time on the estate like a time traveler caught between generous hospitality and the gruesome foreknowledge of what's to come. It wants you to taste a bit of Rudolf Hess's birthday cake, to feel the slight breeze of a warm spring day playing in the river, to smile at Rudolph and Hedwig as they share a little inside joke with each other. I think the film wants you to feel at home. Because right now, you are at home. Not so long ago, perhaps you had some birthday cake. Perhaps you spent some time enjoying a spring day beside sighing trees and shimmering ponds. Perhaps you and someone you love shared one of those laughs together that heals the soul. And when you watch Zone of Interest, you'll find yourself raging at the Hess family, screaming, "Can't you hear what's happening next door? Aren't you listening?" So you tell me, what do you hear?